guest today is Chris Love. Chris, how you doing?
Hey, doing well. Long time no see.
Yep. Welcome back to the show.
That's good to be back.
It's good to be here at the New York Code, or is it the Code Camp NYC? What's the name of this camp? Where
Well,
are
the
we?
hashtag's Code Camp NYC. I just call it the New York Code Camp. But
New York Code Camp
Yeah.
here in Midtown Manhattan.
I think this is
And,
probably my fifth or sixth time
oh,
coming up
really?
here. Yeah.
This is only my second. I had a good time last year. Are you? You're speaking today, later on the
Last
on
slot
what?
today, and I'll be talking about modern web development and enterprises.
What do you mean by that? I know what web development is. I know what the word modern is. And I know what an enterprise. Well, you know what? Actually, let's start with that. What is an enterprise?
That's actually a really good question. I actually see that question asked even on Stack Overflow. And what it is, I kind of see two types of development shops or development teams a lot of times. And you have these small, I consider them more hipster kind of oriented, if you will, development things, and they tend to not.
They code ironically.
Very good, yeah, absolutely. But they tend not to do, say, C# and Microsoft Stack. They do more of a PHP or Apache or Ruby, and now the hot thing's Node.
Mm-hmm.
And then they tend to work on Macs, and they're really
Those rebels.
really are, and
Anarchists.
they do a whole lot of JavaScript and HTML5, CSS3. And they build a lot of their own tools,
Okay.
and those tools are really more open source oriented.
So all those tools you're talking about, they're not being done in big enterprises?
I wouldn't say the same degree.
Okay.
The great thing is you can actually take and use those tools in the enterprise world where, like I said, those places tend to have small teams. Enterprises can sometimes have small teams, and that's a relative term, but usually they tend to be larger teams.
Okay.
And there's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of communication that needs to go on, and you know, a lot of enterprises say they're agile, but that just means they have a daily stand-up,
Right.
and they have a 12-month release cycle, which is still
Yeah.
I call it waterfall.
Waterfront.
So
Got it.
So there's
somebody was saying Scrum Butt. I'm doing Scrum Butt.
Scrum
not doing
Butt,
some
but
stuff.
yeah, and the Scrum meetings usually take an hour or two every morning. And a room of 50, 60 people.
It's like you're reading my mind.
Yes, I think we've all been there, especially as consultants. We get to see this
Okay,
a
so
lot.
these are some particular problems that enterprises team, big organizations tend to have that maybe smaller agile organizations
Right.
tend not to have.
Another thing in enterprises is you have a lot of legacy applications you need to maintain, support, figure out a way to actually make work in today's modern world. And that's something I see a lot of enterprises really struggling with is we've been building this web software basically the same way since the mid to late 90s.
Right.
And I call it the classic web request response model. And now the world's really changed a whole lot because browsers have gotten a heck of a lot better. And we've gotten a lot of new, I think a lot of stuff coming out of that other crowd with, you saw jQuery emerge 4, 5, 6 years ago, really just pick up traction and momentum and just take the world by storm. And HTML5 is really starting to gather momentum, especially outside the enterprise. I want to see it really come into the enterprise quite a bit because I think next spring I'm calling it the coming enterprise apocalypse.
Apocalypse.
Yes, April 8th.
Fire and brimstone,
Yeah, I
cats
think-
and dogs living together.
Yeah, I think April 8th is when Windows XP is officially unsupported at that point.
So
That means
some
there's
panicking.
there's no more security updates, no more patches, things like that. So that I guess it's 13 or 14-year-old operating system
Yeah.
is officially put in the same spot with classic cars.
So is that going to be a wake up call then for IT managers to say, you know what, we really need to get off this?
I would
Pretty
hope
lost.
so. While it's not as big a problem as I saw a couple of years ago, I still see a lot of Windows XP in enterprises mixed with some Windows 7 that has just been recently rolled out kind of attitude.
Okay.
But on top of that, another big problem that kind of proliferates from the XP mentality is Internet Explorer 8. And that's a really bad thing. And most companies are like, well, we can't upgrade because we've got these internal line of business applications that only work in Internet Explorer 8. Half of them are built internally, half of them are third parties, and I've been told over and over again, well, a third party vendor won't upgrade it.
Right, or they don't exist anymore.
And, a lot of it is simple problems that they could probably pretty easily fix, but yet they're not willing to do enough research to do it or have somebody come in and kind of audit to see what kind of problems they might actually have and maybe come in and just fix them in a shorter amount of time. And at the same time, try to get their developer teams up to date on new stuff, because to me there's a lot of modern functionality in new browsers that enterprises can definitely leverage to cut cost, both in the development cycle and the overall running, ongoing cost of applications.
Sure.
Plus, I think they're putting themselves in a really
F12 tools, for example.
well, yeah. F12 tools have really matured. If you've seen the new Internet Explorer 11, they've actually rebuilt from the ground up all the developer tools in Internet Explorer. Chrome has got just a rich set of developer tools, and it kind of all started with Firebug and Firefox, and I think that one's the one that's kind of started to
People
get
don't talk
kind of
about
deleted.
Firefox that much anymore.
Well, I look at browser usage stats on a lot of different places, my own properties and stuff, and Firefox is getting down to that 1% and 2% level a lot of times, and that's kind of interesting. Chrome's basically about 45 to 55%, depending on which one you look at, and then the other part of that's Internet Explorer, and then you see a little Opera in there, here and there, and a few other little outlying browsers with a little speck on the list and things like that. But mostly, all these browsers are modern browsers.
Right.
Like one of the things, like I recently redid my entire blog as a modern single-page application, and I really struggled with how much of my effort I'm going to have to put in to make it work in, say, IE8.
Right.
I actually looked at the traffic on my blog, and I don't know if this is good or bad, but it was less than 1% was IE8 or 7.
You probably alienated them with some
Well, part of me
laboratory
started.
blog posts about
Well,
how you-
part of me started thinking, well, that means that the average enterprise developer may not necessarily be reading blogs to learn how to do stuff.
Ah,
And so I'd be curious to actually look at some of my peers' blog stats to see if they have a similar thing. And another interesting, if you look at some of these like stat counters and Nakami and stuff, the data they make, you can actually see people go to work with the browser statistics. So 9 o'clock on Monday morning, there's a spike in Internet Explorer 8. 5 o'clock, it starts going down until it does this hump all week long until Saturday, and then nobody uses it on the weekend. And then Monday morning, 9 o'clock, it goes back up a little bit.
I see.
And so those are trends. I mean, basically you're forcing people to use something out of date that they don't even want to use. And another thing that's going to probably force the hand of IT on this is people are bringing their own device to work.
Yeah, that's a big trend.
And I think this is another thing that IT departments in mass are looking the other way and not acknowledging. This past spring, I was sitting in a conference room talking to a main developer lead in a pretty large company. They had about 1,500 developers. And she said, our company doesn't have anybody bringing their own device. And I was looking over her shoulder out into the cube farm behind her at her developer team, and I saw 5 iPads, 2 Microsoft Surfaces. Everybody had a smartphone, and everybody was doing at least checking their email on those devices.
Right.
And to not acknowledge what's sitting right in front of her face spoke volumes to me. So, what I'm going to talk about today with the enterprise stuff is, some of these issues, but also kind of get a little bit into some of the technical nuances of how do we, as enterprises, build kind of a workflow to build these modern web applications that are based around web standards and use a lot of JavaScript, because the more I'm pushing forward with modern stuff, the less I'm using the ASP.NET level.
Okay.
I build a lot of my websites now with one controller and maybe 1 or 2 views in them, and then I've got maybe 1 or 2 more controllers for Web API.
In other words, you just serve up that main start page.
Exactly.
And after that, it's all services, all JavaScript.
I'm making calls to get JSON. I'm merging that data with templates on the client side, and I'm dynamically rendering all the markup and stuff. And,
Okay.
And,
so your URL is never changing. Your whole page is never refreshing.
well, it depends. If you need deep linking to something, then I use the hashbang approach.
Okay.
If not, then you don't necessarily have to worry about it. But I just do it out of good practice.
Okay.
So it's one of those things I kind of point out you need to do. But and that's a very scary thing for your traditional enterprise developer, because for a decade basically, at ASP.NET World, we were all taught to a lot of times just drag a control onto a page.
Yep.
And essentially hook them together.
And then drag a data set onto the same page.
Exactly, and say that that's the data source. And,
Yep.
and the days of that are kind of gone. And it's more, a lot of enterprise applications can be written in Sublime or Notepad or a Web Matrix as alternatives to Visual Studio, because you don't need as much of the back-end stuff for that web layer. Now, the back-end, what I call the back-end, I think there's an inflection point there. Everything behind the API, that's still C# world.
Right.
And I see a lot of developers with that mentality that are going to be really good there. And one of the analogies that I like to use, and I think you'll appreciate, I'm a football fan. I actually got to play all the way through college, which is
NC State.
NC State, which is not something most people get the experience to kind of play organized football all the way up till you're 22 or something like that. And think about it. You start off in Pop Warner and you're playing all kinds of positions all over the field, and you're having fun, just goofing around. And then you get into junior high and high school, and by the time you're in varsity in high school, you may be a two-way athlete. You may play like for me, I was the left guard and I was also the place kicker. A lot of guys would be defensive tackle and offensive tackle, or linebacker and fullback, or something like that.
You don't see a lot of offensive linemen that are place kickers, but okay.
It was a little passion of mine. So, but as I got into college, everybody had a position.
Yeah.
And
you need to specialize.
You specialized in that position. Now you may have been a wide receiver that also returned punts, or a defensive back that caught kickoffs, that kind of thing. But generally, if you're an offensive lineman, the best thing you're going to do on special teams is be that front line on the kickoff return.
Right.
And you're going to run back 5 yards, turn around, and that's about it. The rest of it, you're focusing on how to read a defensive line and how to make a trap block or something. And you're going to get really good at making that trap block. And I think the web and just the whole technology as a whole has progressed to now we're not so much in high school anymore where we can do the front end and the back end. We need to kind of pick sides and pick a position that we want to go and we want to specialize in and be really good. And I think enterprises need to recognize that they need people to just focus on their front end stuff and make that really optimized, as well as the back end, because now you're going to, especially when you got a consumer facing thing. I was talking to somebody I was at jQuery conference this week in Austin, and had a great time. But I got to talk to a lot of developers, and a lot of them were enterprise developers, which I was extremely happy to see, because I really thought this was going to be more of the Mac boutique shop kind of developer.
Well, what changed that is because jQuery is in the box of Visual Studio.
Well, that's a big part of it. You're absolutely right.
People think that Microsoft
but,
developers don't want to go outside of Microsoft world.
Exactly.
It's not really true, but they don't like to go outside of Visual Studio.
Well, and the ASP.NET team has done, I think, a really great job of finding a lot of these open source libraries like that and trying to expose the average developer to that.
There's a lot of help for that, but it all started with jQuery. Really.
Yeah, it really did. The jQuery's done so much to push us forward.
Yeah.
And when it came out, the browsers were very kind of uneven, if you will. But now they've really flattened out, and they're very consistent with their APIs, and performance is really seriously on par. I mean, you can look at different tests, and each browser makes their own test, and they're always good at their own test. But
right.
So, I actually saw talked to a lot of developers that weren't Microsoft shops. They were Java shops and things like that, which I don't normally get to talk to. That was really good. But I was talking to one of them, and it's a big national brand here in the U.S., and it's a site that I'm on a lot because I use their product. I'll put it that way. And I've had a lot of problems with them, being the kind of web geek that I am, just seeing a lot of bad practices. And I was really glad to have the conversation with him, because he was telling me, like, yeah, we realized finally, and they pulled me out of the back end, and now I've got a team that's dedicated to fixing the front end.
Ah, okay.
And I was like, I was wanting to do cartwheels talking to him, So that's a really good sign, and I hope more enterprises are looking that direction.
I guess. Well, I don't think those small shops are specializing in one skill set. I mean, they only have, if you've got a shop of 2 or 3 people, you really have to have multiple hats.
Yeah, you really do.
Why are you holding enterprises more accountable to that standard?
Well, I think enterprises tend to. Part of it's because of a lot of business applications. I've started doing math on how much time is wasted on applications running slow, and it's a cost factor there. And it kind of goes back. My graduate thesis was on activity-based costing. Basically, I measured how much energy it took to manufacture different things and stuff. So there's kind of that part to me, but so there's that line of business thing, making business more efficient so they can either be profitable or charge less or expand or whatever they want to do with their capital. The other side of it is a lot of them have consumer-facing presence, like this particular company, and their site, because I actually monitor it and break it down a lot for fun. It was taking 8.5 seconds on average to load, to actually be usable. And that's, right now, it's 1 second is what people expect. If you're over 1 second, that blood pressure starts increasing. And
you're likely to go somewhere else.
Right. Well, and there's been studies. 4% of people have actually thrown their phone waiting on a website to load. So that means that this New York's Code Camp, which there are 300 or 400 or 500 people here.
I'm not sure exactly. It's in the hundreds for sure.
I would say at least a dozen people here have thrown a phone waiting on a website to load on their phone. Rachel, have you thrown your phone?
Yes, I have.
We have friends, so which is technology and friends, right? So.
My phone is broken, but that's not why.
So I mean, that's a very real thing. I mean, it's not necessarily hard to find somebody who's gotten extremely frustrated with something like that.
Okay, so it is.
And they have, and enterprises should have.
Enterprise, we're talking big money. We're talking big projects.
They should have the resources to make things and do things well, according to best practices.
So while we mentioned cost, what the big thing that keeps enterprises or anybody really from migrating these legacy applications to something that's better, more modern, is the fact that there's so much in these things, so much logic inside of these things. It's a huge cost.
Yes.
To try to rewrite this thing.
Right.
Do you have any advice for those?
Yeah, I mean, most likely it's because they didn't follow best practices at the time they built it.
That's true, but it's too late to change that right now.
Well, here's an opportunity to change it.
Okay.
I mean, you're right. We have things that are too tightly coupled in the client side.
For example, yeah.
And I was talking to
that button 1_click method that's 2,000 lines long.
I had one of those not too long ago.
I
inherited one, and I went, it was 2,500 lines though. But I've had that conversation with. I had one last week with a person I know that works at another major consumer brand here actually in the world, and he's like, "Yeah, we're trying to fix our website." He's like, "But you would not believe how much of the back-end logic is built into the web layer."
Yeah.
And he's like, "Every day we're peeling a little bit back."
So that's really the approach I think people need to take, is they need to just make it a little bit better each day.
Yeah.
Just attack it, start to refactor it,
right.
Get some tests
And you have to. There are some basic things I see that you can fix. Like a lot of companies will have the little meta tag in there to force IE7's view engine, for example. Take that out. That's not even going to be supported in IE11.
Okay.
That's going away. They're not going to have compatibility mode anymore. They kind of gave people too much time with that, I think.
I see. Okay.
A lot of those sites actually are not JavaScript heavy at this point. If you think about it, they're still in that request response model, and there's not a whole lot of JavaScript to them. But simple things like just combining and minifying scripts will help their site go significantly faster. Putting the scripts at the bottom, not having 40 script references in a page and 20 CSS files, and kind of knowing how to optimize images. These are just little basic things that a site that takes 8.5 seconds to load, you could probably spend a week or two, and you could knock 6 seconds off pretty fast.
Right.
And also that lowers your cost of doing business too, because now your servers aren't running as hard. You don't have to ship as much data down the wire. There's other little things that happen, and you start. One thing I've kind of noticed is you start doing what I call best practices development, for lack of a better term. You kind of naturally kind of fall into those kind of practices, like organizing your code better is one thing. That's one of the things I want to talk about, in fact, today, is how to structure your file project. So you've got the scripts and stuff in a way that you can maintain it. So standard thing that I think a lot of developers have done, and I've been really guilty of it, is say have your entire application as JavaScript in one file. Just one big giant file. You got to realize if we're working in a team of 10, and you got 8 of us with that same file checked out working on this,
merge those
that's
together.
A giant merge. So I've learned to make little tiny script files, and I know how to extend a JavaScript library a whole lot better than I did 4 years ago. It's little things like that that can mean a whole lot, because you got these source control things you got to deal with, right?
Right.
You got the communication that I was talking about. So Dave, you're going to go work on function foo. I'm going to work on function bar. Fortunately, they're in 2 different files. We're not going to worry about stepping on each other, and we can check those things in, and the project will kind of magically merge. And then how do we build? We've had continuous build mentality for a while, which is good, but now we've got this JavaScript thing which doesn't have a C# compiler.
Right.
So how do we do that? Well, you got tools like Grunt, and there's like continuous integration tools that you can hook these kind of tools into. I can't think of the names off the top of my head. That's kind of where I stop. I'll let like a DevOps person kind of take over.
Cruise Control or MS Build, you mean things like that?
Actually, there's a lot of newer ones that are really tailored more to what I call the modern web stuff. But I use Grunt for a lot of my tasks. Grunt.js. And, it's one of those JavaScript open source things. It's built on top of Node, and it kind of self-installs itself with the NPM kind of thing. Which if you're not familiar with NPM, that's very similar to NuGet.
Okay. It's a package manager.
It's a package manager, so you basically install Node, then you can install Grunt with the NPM manager, and then you install the extensions to Grunt, which are basically like jQuery plugins for Grunt. And so, like, I've got one. There's a whole contrib library, which is really good. So I use Uglify. They're great names. Uglify, Minify. I'm starting to use the JS Hint, which basically is a syntax checker for your JavaScript. So, like, and Visual Studio is getting really good with like static checking of your syntax and stuff like C# and not C#, but JavaScript and CSS. And the Web Essential tools that they've been anyway, Mads is building outside of the kind of out of band, so to speak, but those are awesome, especially with the CSS validation and organizing and making sure you've got the right rules in there and you've covered all the bases. He's done a fantastic job with that, and that keeps getting extended more and more now that he's open sourced it. So there's a lot of great tools for the Visual Studio crowd.
Okay. That's a lot of information.
Yeah, it is.
You're going to pack that all into an hour. That's. I wish I could see it, but I'm speaking actually at the same time.
Exactly. Yeah. There's a lot of great talks here this week.
You're doing a lot of speaking these days, right?
That's a relative thing.
What's coming up for you?
Well, I'm going to be at Dev Connections.
I'll be there.
Yeah, that's right. So Chandra Dahl and I are going to do a workshop on building an enterprise application.
Fantastic.
That first Sunday, and so we've got about 7 hours that we're structuring to basically take you from nothing to at least a viable thing and kind of get you into practice of using these kind of principles.
Okay, that's like September 30th or something like
The
that.
last day of September into till the first Thursday of November. Not November, but October. And then I've got 3 talks. I'm doing basically a similar talk to what I'm doing today. I'm doing one on web performance optimization, and then one that kind of falls out of this talk and goes a little deeper into the testing and debugging side of it, more how to use things like Grunt to actually put that into your work process, so you have better code at the end.
Let's talk about Grunt when we get to Las Vegas.
All right, sounds great.
We'll show that.
We'll do that. It's got a great logo. I love it. So, all right,
thanks
Dave.
so much.
Thank you. Coming up at 11, Technology with Friends.